We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're back after the 1 week break once again at the Apex in Vegas for UFC Vegas 28. Regardless of what you think about the main event between Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Augusto Sakai, we do have a main event and a co-main event consisting of 4 UFC heavyweights, so you can't really moan at 4 big men throwing 4-ounce gloves around. I actually think that the headline fight of Rozenstruik and Sakai is going to give us a very good indication of the trajectory of both fighters, especially considering they're both coming off losses too. I think low-key we're going to see some really fun fights this weekend, so I'm looking forward to breaking it all down for you guys. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365. The last event was a great event for the MMA Play 365 subscribers. We had 2 official bets with Rob Font at -110 and Carla Esparza at +135 that both cashed easily and looked like they both should have been -300 favourites too. There's nothing more satisfying than a cash ticket that proved to be that easy. That was a 110% return on investment for the night as well. The Fun Gamblers section also had one parlay that won, and the money back guarantee dog of the week continued its winning streak, now 5 wins in a row, as the aforementioned Carla Esparza beat Yan Zhao easily as a +135 underdog. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the UFC betting advice and DraftKings FanDuel advice that you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event in the UFC heavyweight division. We've got Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Augusto Sakai. Rozenstruik is currently the slight -115 favourite. The comeback on Sakai, the slight -105 underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, the lines are really close. It's almost a pick 'em, and it's one of those fights where I think that if you've got a good read on either fighter here, then either side of the betting line is playable. However, I do think that Sakai is the value side at -105, but I do understand that Rozenstruik side he's definitely got past the victory, which I'll talk about very soon. So if you do like Rozenstruik, you've got a strong read on that, then like I've already said, the line's playable there as well. Now, as for where this line moves throughout fight week, we have seen a lot of fluctuation. It has slowed down a lot in the last couple of days, but we have entered fight week now, so I expect some line movement. And I do think that the fluctuations are going to happen between the pick'em line and Rozenstruik as a slight favourite. I don't think it's going to go far enough where Sakai gets into the slight favourite and Rozenstruik's looking at -105 or even plus money. So I think that the lines are going to fluctuate a little bit. Ultimately, when we get into fight night on Saturday night, it is either going to be a pick'em or Rozenstruik that slight favourite, in my opinion. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I actually really like this matchmaking for both fighters, because the biggest weakness of both sides in this main event is the wrestling, is the grappling. You know, we've seen in other fights that Rozenstruik's been taken down and controlled. The same goes for Sakai as well. Ultimately, both men got taken down and controlled by the same man in Overeem, who we all thought was a striker until later in his career when he turned into that wrestler and topside grappler. But like I said, they've both got weaknesses there, and it's not going to matter in this fight because both fighters are strikers, and I'll be really surprised if any fighter tried to shoot in for a takedown here and tried to look to grapple their opponent. If any of these fighters do try to look to the grappling, try to take their opponent down, because this is MMA, crazier things have happened, I do think that it's more likely to be from the Sakai side. I don't really have too much in regards to backing that up, but Sakai has scored a takedown in the UFC, so I suppose that's better than nothing in regards to backing that up. But either way, I don't see this fight hitting the mat, and for whatever reason, if it does, then I'm quite confident enough to say that the work that gets done on the mat won't be effective enough to have any sort of influence on how this fight plays out. So I do think the fight's won and lost on the feet, and that's where we've really got to analyse here, because you've got Jairzinho Rozenstruik that does, I've mentioned it before, he does have that death touch on his punch. You know, he can be losing a fight and then suddenly that one punch lands, his opponent's flatlined and he's won the fight. But the one area that I really don't like from Rozenstruik's perspective is he tends to wait for that big punch opportunity too much. It causes inactivity in the cage, it affects his volume really isn't great at all. And then on the flip side here, you've got Sakai. Now, Sakai, for the most part, in the striking department, is completely opposite to Rozenstruik. Sure, Sakai's got power, he is a big heavyweight, he can knock people out, it's not as if he can't, and I'm saying that he's pillow fisted or anything like that, because that's absolutely not true, but Sakai is more more a volume-based striker. He won't be looking to land that one big shot to knock his opponent out. He'll be looking to rack up volume, just touch his opponent, just keep busy, keep that activity up. And Sakai actually lands more than 5 strikes on average per minute as well, which is very high for a UFC heavyweight. So the volume, the activity coming from Sakai is going to be up against the power coming from Rozenstruik, because I feel that if Rozenstruik doesn't knock Sakai out, then Sakai is just going to outland him. Rozenstruik's got that kickboxing background, Sakai's got the Muay Thai background, so from a technical standpoint it's going to be really interesting on the feet, but I just feel that Rozenstruik, sure, he uses some kicks, he mixes those in with his punches as well, but the combinations with the hands aren't always long combinations. It does tend to be one punch at a time, and like I said, he can find himself waiting a little too long, whereas Sakai's pumping out 1-2s, he's throwing low kicks. He actually has a really nice low kick as well, and if he uses that here and slows that movement and the volume of Rozenstruik even more, then he could end up making him comfortable for himself. But I just feel he's more athletic, more active, and like I said, if Rozenstruik doesn't find that knockout, I just find it really hard to see him winning this fight. The thing is, like I've already mentioned, Rozenstruik does have that knockout power, and he can land it late in fights as well, as we saw in the Overeem fight where he deaded Overeem with like a second or two to go. So like I've already mentioned, Rozenstruik's got the death touch. He's got 5 rounds to land it in. He can land it over 5 rounds. I do think that it was much harder for him to get that shot landed on someone like Cyril Gane opposed to what it will be with Sakai, just because I think Gane is a much bigger, much more technical, composed fighter with good range. I think that Sakai's got some of those qualities as well, but not on the level Gane's at. So I do think that Rozenstruik could have a higher percentage probability of knocking Sakai out than what he could have done against Cyril Gane. So there's definitely that to take into consideration. But I just keep coming back to Sakai here. Everybody that has listened to my analysis and breakdowns over the years, you know that for the most part, I will always trust the guy that looks to try and land the volume, and if a finish comes along the way, great. If it doesn't, then they'll get the decision, opposed to the fighter that needs that knockout to win the fight, and that's the way that I'm heading here. So I do think that Sakai lands more volume. I also think there's a chance Sakai could get absolutely knocked out as well, but he's never been knocked out in mixed martial arts by strikes on the feet. The only KO TKO loss was against Overeem on the mat, so again, that just adds to where I'm sort of leading here. So I am going to be picking Augusto Sakai to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Walt Harris versus Marcin Tybura. Tybura is currently the -165 favourite. The comeback on Harris at +145 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the line's quite accurate, if I'm being honest. It's where I expected it to be. If you are going to push me for a value side, considering who these two guys are in the division that they're fighting in, I would say that Harris has got the slight value on that +145 line, but like I said, I do think it's very accurate, and I agree with where the line sits as I'm recording this podcast. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I actually don't think it's going to move too much, if I'm being honest. I feel that, as I've already said, the line's accurate. It's going to fluctuate either way. You know, you are going to see some bets on Tybura. You are also going to see bets on Harris as well. Ultimately, I do think it's going to even itself out, and when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I expect the betting lines to not be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, it's going to be really interesting, and I do think it lies on Tybura's game plan, because if Tybura comes out here looking for takedowns, looking to get the fight to the mat, then I think that's going to be his easiest way of winning this fight, and also the path of least resistance as well, especially late in the fight. If Harris does start to get a bit tired because he's wrestling and grappling, I do think Tybura will be able to take over late, but the fight's going to be dangerous for Tybura early on here with Walt Harris, because Harris has got that explosive power. He will come forward, he's athletic, he'll throw high kicks, he'll throw his big left hand as well, look to pin you up against the cage and unload. Now, the thing is with Tybura, if this fight was a couple of years ago, I'd be absolutely all over Walt Harris here, and actually Walt Harris could probably end up being the -200 favourite back 2 years ago as well. Now, credit where credit's due, Tybura Tybura has turned a corner. At one point he was looking completely declined and washed up to the point where we probably didn't expect him to stay in the UFC for too much longer, but he's gone on a nice win streak here. He's put wins together. He's looking like a brand new fighter, and that's the reason why he's a favourite in this spot. He's just looking much more calm and composed, and just like Arlovski, he seems to have grown a chin back as well. So as I've said, credit where credit's due. I do think that Tybura has the best path to victory in this fight though, and that's sort of why I agree with where the betting line is, because although, as I've said, it's going to be dangerous for him early on, I do feel that we're going to get vibes of Tybura's last fight against Greg Hardy. I think Walt Harris is going to have some success early on. I'm just not totally convinced that he puts Tybura out, although it is absolutely possible. As I've just mentioned in the last fight with Rozenstruik and Sakai, you know, this is the heavyweight division and all it takes is one punch. We all know that. But I do think that Tybura can weather a storm here. He has been weathering storms. He has looked rejuvenated, and I think if he can get out of that first round and just make Harris work in that first round as well, then I think he will start being able to tie up with Harris, take him down, get that top control, and that's where Tybura is strong, especially in this fight. He's got good top control, he's got good jiu-jitsu. If he gets Harris down, I'm honestly not expecting Harris to be popping back up to his feet instantly or anything like that. I do think that Tybura will be able to establish that good top control position and just go to work, land ground and pound, either see out the round or finish Harris on the mat. So like I say, Harris is definitely live early. If he knocks Tybura out in round one, I am not going to be shocked. Neither should anybody. But again, like I said with Sakai, I just think the longer game here, I think that Tybura, the longer the fight goes on, the better he can look, and that's the fighter that I tend to trust more often than not. For those reasons, I'm picking Marcin Tybura to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Roman Dolidze versus the fighter stepping in on short notice, Laureano Staropoli. Dolidze is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Staropoli at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think that the line, again, as I've just mentioned, is quite accurate. It's fair. I completely understand where it is. If you are going to push me for a value side though, I would say that Dolidze at -140 is the better bet than Staropoli at +120. I'll explain why a little bit later on. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move too much from where we're sitting now. I actually think, as I've said, the lines are fair and we're going to see some money coming in on Dolidze. I think we're going to see some money coming in on Staropoli, but I really don't think that this betting line is just going to go wild and head out for Dolidze close to -200, and I don't think it's going to come close to a pick'em either. I do think, as I've said, we see some fluctuation, but that'll be fluctuation on either side, and when they both step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't expect the betting lines to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, one of the big concerns for me here with Staropoli, and I actually like both fighters, by the way, I've bet both fighters before, I just like the styles, I like the fighting ethic, and like I say, I'm a fan of both guys, but the one concern that I have from Staropoli's perspective is he's stepping up not only on short notice but up a weight class as well. Now I thought welterweight was perfect for Staropoli. He wasn't a small welterweight obviously, but he also wasn't a huge welterweight either. He was just at the right physique for that weight, and now he's stepping in on short notice. I don't know whether this is going to be a permanent move to middleweight, or I don't know whether it's just because it's short notice and he didn't have time to cut the weight that he needed to cut, but the fact is he's stepping in on short notice, he's going up a weight class, and he's not only going up a weight class against someone like Dolidze, but Dolidze is a fighter coming down in weight as well. Obviously this will be a second fight at middleweight, but this is a guy that looked absolutely fine at 205 pounds at light heavyweight. So to me the size is definitely concerning, because you've got an absolutely huge middleweight in there versus a blown up welterweight, in all due respect. So it's going to be interesting to see how they match up physically, but I do think that Dolidze has advantage in that physicality already, and ultimately that's where I see Dolidze winning this fight, because I like Dolidze's ground game, his grappling, he's got takedowns. Even his last fight against Trevin Giles, that wasn't an easy fight for him. Trevin Giles is tricky in regards to the wrestling and the grappling, especially defensively, but Dolidze hung in there. He did tire later in the fight, but he is cutting weight down to middleweight now, and his work rate was high in that fight. There was a lot of clinch work, a lot of wrestling, as I've already said, and that's the stuff that takes it out of fighters even more. So the fact that Dolidze can put that type of performance on and still be able to perform in the later rounds, of round 3, that's something that I did like to see from him. And like I said, I feel that that's where he's going to win the fight, because from Staropoli's perspective, he's a good striker, he's technical as well. So's Dolidze. Dolidze's a good striker also, but the thing is, I feel that Staropoli is going to have more volume out in space, and that's going to be key, and that's going to force Dolidze into closing the distance, tying up, trying to get the fight down to the mat. And Dolidze's jiu-jitsu is seriously good, so I think that if he does get Staropoli down, he's going to be able to control top positions, as long as he doesn't do anything stupid like dropping for a heel hook or anything like that when he's clearly controlling the fight on the mat. Then I feel that he's going to have a lot of success. It wouldn't shock me for him to submit Staropoli and get him out of there on the mat either. But like I say, I do feel that Dolidze is going to have advantages, size, physicality, and I feel the game plan is going to be to take Staropoli down. And if it's not, I do think that halfway through round one, when Staropoli's got his reads and he's feeling his way into the fight, that we're just going to see that output from Staropoli force Dolidze into, looking for those takedowns, because Dolidze will probably feel that he's going to start falling behind on the scorecards if he doesn't change things up. So I think the early moments in this fight, I think Staropoli is going to look decent, but I think the longer the fight goes on, the more Dolidze is going to make those in-cage adjustments and start looking for takedowns, and that's where he's going to have success. Based on that, I think that Dolidze can score 2 out of the 3 rounds, and like I've already said, I'm not going to be surprised if Dolidze did submit Staropoli and get him out of there along the way either. So for those reasons, I'm picking Roman Dolidze to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is probably the most intriguing fight on the card, in my opinion. We've got Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Miguel Baeza. Baeza is currently the -130 favourite. The comeback on Ponzinibbio at +110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the betting line's in a really good position, if I'm being honest, because you've got two sides of the coin here. You've got people that are absolutely not writing Ponzinibbio off. He's still the fighter he was before his layoff and injuries, and at +110, that's absolutely a bet there. But then you've also got, on the other side of the coin, people that like Baeza. He's a prospect, a legit talent. And if you're on Baeza's side here, and Baeza does go out and beat Ponzinibbio, then it's going to be a long time before we see -130 on Baeza's line again. So people who are absolutely high on Baeza will get that good line this time around, because -130 is a close line. So the betting line is really intriguing. I personally think that from a value side, I think the -130 on Baeza is the slightly better bet than Ponzinibbio at +110. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there's a lot of people that feel that Baeza is going to get steamed later in fight week, and that might be the case, but I also think that the recency bias on this betting line, there is some there, and Ponzinibbio isn't a fighter that we know is declined and washed. He's still got that name value. He would have had a title fight if it wasn't for the injuries and the layoff as well. I totally believe that. So I do think at some point it is going to hit a brick wall and the money would come back in on Ponzinibbio. So I don't agree with the people that think that this betting line is going to get steamed. I actually think the opposite. I think the longer we go through fight week, I think the more the line is going to close up, and I think it's actually going to close at around a pick'em as well. Maybe Baeza is a slight favourite, but if I'm wrong and Ponzinibbio ends up as a slight favourite, I wouldn't actually be surprised at that either. That's why I think the betting line is okay right now, but I do expect some Ponzinibbio money coming in for sure. Now, as for how this fight plays out, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the recency bias, because we have seen it time and time again when a top fighter gets injured, they have a layoff, they come back, they get knocked out in round 1 or knocked out at some point in the fight, and suddenly everybody's jumping on the bandwagon of the wash, the declined. I'm not necessarily on that train with Ponzinibbio, although I will say that Ponzinibbio really didn't look that great. He did look a little bit sketchy in regards to his movement and his timing. He couldn't really get anything down, and in the meantime he was getting cracked. And to be honest, no disrespect to Li Jingliang, but Jingliang isn't that top 10 fighter that you would expect those fighters to beat Ponzinibbio, and anybody outside of top 10 Ponzinibbio should be handling. So there was a lot of things to not like about Ponzinibbio's performance, but I'm not yet quick to jump to the fact that he's washed and declined. I'd need to see him again. Now, the problem that Ponzinibbio is going to have is he needed time in that last fight against Li Jingliang to get the ring rust out the way, to get his feel again for fighting in the UFC under the brightest lights. He needed time in the cage to just physically and mentally get back into the game. And the concern for Ponzinibbio is he didn't have that time. He was knocked out before he even got chance to let anything go, put combinations together, start mixing things up. So that, from a mental perspective, is going to follow him into this fight with Baeza. He's still going to need time in there against Baeza to get his feel, to get reads physically, mentally, as I've already spoken about, get his head back into the game. And I actually think that Baeza is a much tougher fighter than Li Jingliang, and I think that's, from a mental perspective, one thing that I really don't like about this fight for Ponzinibbio. And Baeza is a legit talent. He is a legit prospect. His striking is clean, it's crisp, he's developing as well, which is really important. On the Contender Series, he was really green, repetitive combinations, throwing the same thing over and over again, but now he's starting to mix things up really well. He's starting to stretch his game, he's got nice fundamentals, he's got power everywhere. Even in his jab, he's got power. His low kicks, he kicks like a mule. And now we know he's got a ground game. We knew he had a BJJ black belt, but sometimes, you know, you need to see that BJJ black belt to realize what type of black belt that is. But we saw that against Takashi Sato. Baeza looked solid on the mat. He didn't look like he was struggling. He looked calm. He was composed. He knew where he was going from position to position. So we're now looking at a fighter that's a prospect, that's well-rounded, and he's going to be really tough to beat. The thing is, in this fight, it is a really big step up for Baeza. You know, you've got to look at that. You can't ignore the fact that this is by far the biggest fight of his career and the best opponent he'll ever have had in front of him in Ponzinibbio. And if Baeza can't get Ponzinibbio out early and the fight goes longer and Ponzinibbio grows into the fight, then that's when the fight's going to get a little bit closer, and that's obviously why the betting line is very close. If the fight does go longer and Ponzinibbio does start to piece Baeza up, you do have to think, you know, is Baeza just going to get overrun at that point? But then to counter that, we've seen Baeza in adversity come through that adversity. When he was almost finished by Matt Brown, he came back. He looked great about 30 seconds after nearly being out, and then he finished Matt Brown after that. So I don't think that Baeza is one of these loose prospects that's on a hype train that we're just waiting for it to be derailed. I do legitimately think that he is a really solid prospect and a really talented fighter. I think he deserves this fight with Ponzinibbio. I don't think he's going to be out of his depth. I do think the longer the fight goes on, the closer it's going to get. But ultimately, I just think that Baeza's going to be able to outgun Ponzinibbio here. He's younger, he's developing rapidly, he's looking like he's putting everything together right now. I didn't like what I saw against Li Jingliang from Ponzinibbio's perspective. He struggled to get going, he didn't get the cage time that he needed to get all of that layoff and all of those injuries out of his head. He's going to bring that into this fight. So early on, Baeza is definitely going to need to capitalise on that, which I think he can do because he starts quite fast himself. I do have concerns from Ponzinibbio's perspective of what happens when he starts getting cracked hard by Baeza. Does he start getting flashbacks of that Li Jingliang loss? Does he start retreating a little bit? Again, the mental game in this sport is just so crucial and so important. So does Ponzinibbio not like to get hit once he starts feeling Baeza's power? Also, like I said, Baeza kicks like a mule. If Baeza starts really hammering those low kicks early on, when Ponzinibbio probably is more vulnerable in this spot, then that's going to pay dividends throughout the fight. It's going to slow Ponzinibbio down and Baeza's going to be able to take over later. So this is what I mean. I think that the weapons that Baeza's got, especially early in this fight, can set himself up for a really good fight here. I do still think that the longer the fight goes on, the closer it gets, but I like Baeza in this spot. I think he's going to be able to land enough volume on Ponzinibbio. I think he's going to be able to hurt him, whether that be shots to the face or whether that be just breaking down the lead leg of Ponzinibbio. And I just don't think that Ponzinibbio is going to be able to get into that flow early enough to really make an effect on Baeza to make that fight comfortable for him moving forward. I think Baeza's a legit talent. I don't think Ponzinibbio's washed, but again, you look at the talent of Baeza. Aside from Neil Magny in that last win streak that Ponzinibbio had, Baeza very likely beats all the fighters that Ponzinibbio has beaten. Again, aside from Magny, I will give credit where it's due to Magny. He's turned a corner, but I like Baeza, and although this is a step up in competition, although it's not going to be an easy fight for him, I am picking Miguel Baeza to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Dusko Todorovic versus the newcomer Gregory Rodrigues. Todorovic is currently the minus 160 favourite. The comeback on Rodrigues at plus 140 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I actually think the value sits with the underdog in Rodrigues at plus 140. I think the line should be much closer, especially when you're looking at Todorovic's last fight crossed with the style stylistic advantages that I do think Rodrigues is going to be bringing into this cage. As I've said, the line should be closer, so at plus 140, that's where I'm seeing the value on the underdog. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, this line was much wider, but a lot of money's coming in on Rodrigues, and I do agree with that line movement, that trend in the line movement, but that money coming in on Rodrigues does seem to have stalled. In fact, the betting line itself seems to have stalled to the point where there's not too much money coming in on either side. Obviously, we are in fight week, so you can expect some line movement here, and I actually expect the bigger action to come in on the favourite in Todorovic. Obviously, he's the fighter that's fought in the UFC numerous times now. Rodrigues is the guy coming in on short notice, making his UFC debut. Even though Todorovic had a bad fight in his last fight, I do think that people are going to be still siding with him, and when they're looking at where the money's going to go on either side, I think it's going to go towards Todorovic opposed to Rodrigues. So I do think Todorovic is going to close at around minus 175. The comeback on Rodrigues at that point would be around plus 150, plus 155. As for how this fight plays out though, I think it's going to be a really good fight, and Todorovic is actually a solid fighter, but he's just so hard to trust because of his chin. And I actually bet him last time out against Punahele Soriano, and I actually said in that breakdown that he will be the better fighter from a technical standpoint and more well-rounded as well, and that my only concern really was his chin. You know, he tends to sort of duck and weave, and rather than keep his hands up and block punches or block kicks, he'll tend to try and move out of the way of them, which is always a worry. And I did say that at some point he's going to get caught and he's going to get knocked out. I just didn't think it was going to be against Punahele Soriano because I thought the distance would be closed, all that sort of stuff. But actually it was terrible, to the point where he got tested early on with his chin got cracked, and he just didn't make any adjustments. He didn't think, okay, now I've got to keep my hands up and start blocking punches with my hands or my arms. He kept his hands low and he just got cracked time after time in the chin and eventually got knocked out. And that is just a really big concern. It just shows me that that's the style of fighting that he's used to, and he didn't make those adjustments because it would feel unnatural to him. So I expect Dusko Todorovic to come in with the same problems in this fight. I don't think he can fix that in between one fight. So I think that Todorovic is going to come in again. I think he's going to have hands low. I think he's going to try and outstrike Rodrigues early on, potentially then close the distance and look to try and take him down. He's got to do that in this fight. Todorovic cannot stand at range with somebody like Rodrigues, who has got straight punches and power in those straight punches. He can't stay at range with that sort of fighter. He's got to close the distance, pin him up against the cage, try and work inside the clinch. That's where Todorovic is really strong, that clinch work, and then he'll look to take his opponent down. But Rodrigues is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so I don't know if Todorovic is going to want to try and take him down here, because I do think that Rodrigues is going to be the better grappler. I think he's going to be able to get out of bad positions if Todorovic takes him down, maybe sweep and reverse as well. So for me, the safest place for Todorovic to be in this fight is in that clinch position on the feet against the cage, but you're running a few risks there. Firstly, you're not going to be scoring very highly on the judges' scorecards. You're also going to run the risk of the referee potentially breaking and splitting the fight up, getting back into the centre of the cage, and that's when it's dangerous again. You've got to close the distance again. So this is what I think, and why I think stylistically Rodrigues has got advantages in this fight, because at range, I think he's going to have success. I think he's got every chance of knocking Todorovic out. And I also think that Rodrigues has got advantages on the mat as well. So it's going to be a really interesting fight. I'm really interested to see what Todorovic comes out looking like. Has he made those adjustments that he needs to? If he hasn't, is he closing the distance? Does he attempt to take down and risk potentially getting swept, reversed by the BJJ black belt? I just think that from a paths to victory perspective, Rodrigues has more paths to victory. He has different ways to win this fight. I think from a skill set perspective, Todorovic is the better fighter, especially on the feet. But the reason why I can't trust him on the feet is because of his durability and his liability in regards to being defensively responsible, and I think that's a really big problem, and that's going to be a problem until he sorts it out. So for those reasons, I'm picking Gregory Rodrigues to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Tom Breese versus Antonio Arroyo. Breese is currently the minus 245 favourite. The comeback on Arroyo at plus 205 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do see why the line is so wide, but on the same token, if you are going to push me for a value side, I do think that plus 205 on Arroyo is definitely the better bet than Breese at minus 245. As for where the line moves throughout fight week, I do think we're going to see some fluctuations, and I think we're going to see fluctuations on both sides. From Arroyo's side at plus 205, it's a nice line. Sure, Arroyo's got some massive flaws, which I'll talk about soon, but he's also a dangerous fighter, so at plus 205, you're going to get some value there. But I also think that people are going to look past that a little bit. They'll see that Breeze's skill set is head and shoulders above Arroyo's, and they'll start to put him in parlays, and that's where the money will come from Breese. So I think that Tom Breese is going to be in the parlays. I think Arroyo is going to be people's dog shots here as well. So that's going to cause the fluctuation. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think that Arroyo will be a slightly shorter underdog than what he is right now, but I don't think the lines are going to move too much, if I'm being honest. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I'm really interested to see how Breese looks here, because there has been inconsistencies in his game now. He's got all the skills to be a really top level fighter, and there's just something blocking him from reaching that potential. And it could be something from a mental perspective. It could just be the fact that this is the highest level in mixed martial arts, and he's just coming against some really top level fighters that are beating him. You know, it happens in this sport. Every fighter takes losses. So I do think that there's something stopping Breese from reaching that high ceiling. He's got the skills and abilities, but he can be broken down in the fight at the same time. And that's ultimately where I think that Arroyo is a live underdog in this spot, because especially early on, Arroyo is very dangerous. He's got powerful kicks. He comes out in that karate stance. He manages range really well. He slides in and out of range well also. And like I said, everything that comes from the kicks from Arroyo just hits hard. You can tell he's working a little bit on his boxing as well. I definitely think that Breese is the better boxer though. So for me, for Arroyo to give himself the best chance of winning, he's got to stay at that kicking range, and he could actually break down Breese early and get a finish in that first round, or maybe break him down so much that Breese is hurt. You know, he might be struggling to step on his lead leg, for example. Remember, this is southpaw versus southpaw as well, so that lead leg is going to be available to be kicked for Tom Breese. So it could be one of those fights where Arroyo uses round 1 to really break his opponent down and then take over in round 2. Now, the problem I've got with Arroyo is his cardio. He's got big gas tank issues to the point where it needs to be fixed, because if he does come out in round 1 fast and hard and he doesn't hurt or break Breese down enough where it's easy for him to take over late, then Breese is going to be the one taking over late. I think he'll be able to find takedowns. I think he'll be able to put Arroyo on his back. And to be honest, with how tired Arroyo gets in fights, Breese wouldn't even need to guarantee takedowns to win the rounds either. He'd just be able to outstrike him. Like I said, his boxing's better. He's sure he'd have some big shots to think about whilst he's on the feet, but those shots will come few and far between. They'll be wound up as well. They'll be telegraphed. He'll be able to handle himself. So for me, it all depends on what happens in that first round. I think Arroyo has to have a massive first round, potentially finish Breese or get Breese to the point where he's almost finished, and that he can come out in the second round and finish what he started in that first round. But if that doesn't happen, I think Breese takes over this fight very comfortably the longer it goes on. And actually for Breese, if he comes out in that first round, closes the distance and takes Arroyo down and makes Arroyo work hard in that first round, then Arroyo's not going to even have any of these massively dangerous moments throughout the fight. So this is where I'm leaning towards Breese. I do think, as I've already mentioned, from a value perspective, the plus 200 line is good on Arroyo. He is live at that sort of betting line, but Breese is the more skilled fighter. He is better in more areas in mixed martial arts, on the feet, in the boxing range, takedowns, grappling. That's where Breese is better, and I think that's going to be enough to give Breese a win here and to drag this win, whether it be a late finish or win on the scorecards. I'm picking Tom Breese to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Makwan Amirkhani versus the newcomer stepping in on short notice, Kamuela Kirk. Amirkhani is currently the minus 280 favourite. The comeback on Kirk at plus 220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do agree with the betting line. I did expect it to be at this sort of price range. However, if you are going to push me for a value side, it might come as a surprise to a few people, but I do think that the plus 220 on Kirk's line has more value in it than Amirkhani at minus 280, and you'll be able to understand where my thoughts are in regards to that whilst I'm breaking the fight down very shortly as well. But as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think the line's going to close up a little bit. the minus 280 for Amirkhani might turn into minus 260, maybe even minus 250, but I would be surprised if it went any shorter than minus 250. I think that would be the brick wall. At that point, people would start betting Amirkhani straight. He'll probably be in parlays as well. So I do think that when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I do expect Amirkhani to be around that minus 270, minus 275 betting line. But as for how this fight plays out, stylistically, I feel that both of these fighters are going to match up really well against each other. They both got good striking. They both can eat strikes and deliver strikes back. They exchange really well. Now, from a wrestling perspective, Kirk does have takedowns, but he doesn't go to them as often as he should, in my opinion. I do think that Amirkhani is going to be the better wrestler in this fight, which probably does give him that edge to go and win the fight, because I feel that whichever fighter is on bottom for longer periods in this fight is the fighter that's ultimately going to lose the fight. And I feel that the striking on the feet is going to be very, very close. I would give Amirkhani the edge on the feet, but I don't think it's a huge edge. And that's what makes me think that the takedowns are going to start coming in this fight now. I just feel that Amirkhani is going to beat Kirk to the punch when it comes to the takedowns. He's going to be the one shooting first, and therefore he's going to be the one completing his takedowns. I do think that Amirkhani's got a submission threat as well. Not that Kirk hasn't, but I think Amirkhani's submission threat is greater than the finishing ability of Kirk on the mat. So this is where, although I'm still seeing value in that plus 220 betting line of Kirk, I think the fight is going to play out much closer than that betting line suggests. So that's why I'm saying that. I just think the striking's even. I think the wrestling, yes, Amirkhani's got a slight edge. It's not a huge edge. And then, like I say, I think the grappling, Kirk's a BJJ black belt himself. So everything's just going to be close in this fight. I think it's going to be a really good scrap. I think we're going to get to the scorecards where each fighter has definitively taken a round, but then you've got that other round, that third round somewhere along the line that's close and could have potentially gone either way. I do think it's genuinely going to be a close fight, but I said when it goes to the scorecards and it's looking like this and that, I do think that if there is a finish in this fight, it is more likely to be Amirkhani via a submission. I don't think it's going to be a knockout. I'd be surprised anyway. Kirk's a Hawaiian. He's tough. He can take that damage. We've seen him, and he's so durable in those fiery exchanges. So I don't think Amirkhani is going to knock him out, but if there is a finish throughout this fight, I would expect Amirkhani to be the more likely fighter to finish via submission. And ultimately, although, like I said, that plus 220 line is good for Kirk, I am going to be picking Makwan Amirkhani to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Montana De La Rosa versus Ariane Lipski. De La Rosa is currently the minus 260 favourite. The comeback on Lipski at plus 220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the betting line's fair. It's accurate where it's sitting right now. I completely get it. And if you do ask me for a value side, I would still say the value sits with the favourite in Montana De La Rosa at minus 260. I feel that that would be a better bet than taking the underdog shot on Lipski at plus 220. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I use this word a lot. I do think we're going to see some fluctuation. I think that we are going to see money coming back in on Lipski. People like her for obvious reasons, but those reasons will only last so long on the betting line before the sharp heads come back on De La Rosa and start betting that good line. So I think the betting line is going to close roughly where we're sitting right about now, but if there is going to be any major movement, I would expect De La Rosa to get closer to minus 300 than what it's going to get closer to minus 200. But as for how this fight plays out, the way to beat Lipski is absolutely blueprinted at this point. Antonina Shevchenko, last time out, I bet Shevchenko there, and even I didn't expect the type of dominance in that way. And what I mean by that is Shevchenko took Lipski down easily when she wanted to. She was able to control the fight in top position. She was able to get good work with ground and pound, submission attempts. She just absolutely had a way with Lipski, and Lipski had no answer off her back, and that does seem to be a massive weakness for Lipski. And the more concerning thing is for this fight is that Shevchenko is known as a striker. Sure, her sister's got solid wrestling and grappling, but Antonina Shevchenko is known for using her ability on the feet with a Muay Thai, with a kickboxing to light her opponents up. So the fact that Shevchenko came in there with a wrestling game plan, a grappling game plan, and was able to execute it easily. Definitely a concern in this fight, considering Montana De La Rosa is a wrestler. That's where her background is. That's a base of MMA. She's going to be able to score takedowns in this fight. And for argument's sake, if she can't, or if she doesn't go to a wrestling, which would be absolutely ridiculous if that happened, De La Rosa's striking is getting better, her boxing's getting better, to the point I'm actually not convinced that Lipski's even going to be the better striker in this fight. I think it would be close. There might be an edge either side here, but I just don't feel that De La Rosa is completely out of depth on the feet at all. However, I do think that De La Rosa's going to go for a takedowns here. There's absolutely no way that she's seen that Antonina Shevchenko fight and thought, do you know what, I'll test my striking. If she does, then I will be genuinely shocked, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think De La Rosa's going to go into the cage, she's going to shoot takedowns, she's going to be able to have a way with Lipski. She might even be able to find a submission along the way. If she doesn't, I think that she's going to be able to control the fight and the remainder of the round from when that takedown happens and win rounds that way. And I do see this being a very, very comfortable win for De La Rosa as long as she shoots them takedowns. I do think she's going to shoot the takedowns. She gives us no reason to think that she won't. She goes for takedowns in pretty much every single fight, every single time that she's inside the cage. So it does have a style you can trust as well. For all those reasons, I'm picking Montana De La Rosa to win this fight. And in the next fight, back in the heavyweight division again, we've got Tanner Boser versus Ilir Latifi. Boser's currently the minus 200 favourite. They come back on Latifi at plus 170 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Latifi. I think the line's too wide. I think it should be much closer. And the path to victory for Latifi is very clear in this fight as well. So I just feel that he has got a solid path to victory, so at plus 170, the line is simply too wide. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that we're going to see some Tanner Boser love, to be honest. I think that Boser will move from minus 200 maybe to minus 220, minus 225. I think if he got to minus 250, that would hit the line brick wall at that point, and we could start seeing money coming back in on Latifi. But ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think that Boser's going to be around minus 225 with Latifi at around plus 185, plus 190. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I do think it relies on Latifi and what Latifi does or doesn't do. If Latifi goes in there and he looks to close the distance with Boser, tie up with him, use his strength and his power, he's a little workhorse, he's a little machine. I call him little. He's a big heavyweight, but he's just small in height. But he is very stocky and he's a powerhouse in there. So if he goes in there and starts clinching up with Boser and looking to lift Boser up and take him down, I think Latifi could win the fight in that scenario. And not only win it, but win it relatively comfortably as well. I don't think Boser's easy to take down when you've got technique, but the fact that Latifi uses raw power and strength opposed to just solid technique in regards to the wrestling, I think that's going to help him score takedowns in the heavyweight division, especially against guys that can defend takedowns, because Boser will be looking to defend the fundamentals, but Latifi will just be looking to use raw power, and I think that's where Latifi will come up good. However, if Latifi doesn't have this close the distance game plan, wrestling game plan, looking to lift his opponents up and slam them, I do think that he's in a lot of trouble in this fight, because Boser's better on the feet, he's better at range, he's got more weapons in his arsenal when it comes to his striking, low kicks, he's got good fundamentals with his jab, a good 1-2, he's good moving forwards and moving backwards as well. Boser can strike at different ranges, and then like I say, strike moving backwards, which is really important because Latifi will look to be a meathead on the feet and come forward. So I do think Latifi is definitely in trouble on the feet. He's also liable to be knocked out as well, but we can't forget that Latifi went 3 rounds with Derek Lewis. He didn't get knocked out by Lewis. He was able to take Lewis down. He was able to pick him up and slam Lewis, so that's impressive in itself. And like I say, the fact that he didn't get knocked out against Lewis, he took some of his best shots as well. That's got to count for something. And listen, some people thought Latifi won that fight. I do believe they were in Texas, so obviously Lewis got the nod on the scorecards in a close fight, but this is why I think the line's wide, because Derek Lewis is now, or we think he's going to be fighting Ngannou for that title shot. He's looked great, he's made his way back up to a number 1 contender fight, and if Latifi's going to close decisions against Lewis, and then he's a plus 170 underdog against somebody like Boser, who isn't at that top 5 level, you've got to see some value in that. And I actually think, like I said, as long as Latifi comes in here, closes the distance, looks to take Boser down to the mat, and often, I do think he's going to be able to win the fight. I definitely give Boser the edge on the feet. Not a massive edge, but he's definitely got clear edges. And I think that would be enough to make Latifi think, okay, I need to now start shooting for takedowns. If he does have too many moments on the feet out in space, I think it'll only cause Latifi to close the distance and shoot the takedowns with the skill set that Boser has. I think that Latifi will be able to implement his game plan, and at plus 170, I will be siding with the underdog. I'm picking Ilir Latifi to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Francisco Trinaldo versus Muslim Salikov. Salikov is currently the minus 225 favourite. The comeback on Trinaldo at plus 185 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think that the value sits with the underdog in Trinaldo. The line's really wide. I do think it should be much closer to a pick'em, and there's also an argument that Trinaldo could potentially be a slight favourite as well. So because of that, I do think that the value sits with that plus 185 line on Trinaldo. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think again we're going to see some money coming in on either side. I do think at this line we are going to see money coming in on Trinaldo, and at some point it will get so low that money starts coming back in on Salikov. But I do think the line's going to close quite a bit by the time they step into the cage on Saturday night. I don't think it'll get close to a pick'em, but I could see Trinaldo at plus 140, plus 150, with Salikov being around that minus 175, minus 180 line. But as for how this fight plays out, I do think this fight could be relatively close because both fighters are predominantly strikers, and they're also both really low volume as well. So it could be strike for strike throughout the fight, and if there isn't a knockout, then we get to a judge's decision and suddenly the fight's really close and nobody knows which way it's going to be scored. So I do think it's going to be a low volume striking affair. The one thing that I do feel Salikov has as an equaliser is his power in his right hand, and although you can never rule that knockout out from that right hand of Salikov, it would come somewhat as a surprise, as Trinaldo's never been knocked out in his MMA career. So I do think that from a finishing perspective, Salikov is the more likely fighter to finish the fight, but I also think that Trinaldo's more well-rounded. I think his wrestling's better. I think his topside grappling's better as well. Salikov is getting a little bit harder to take down, but Trinaldo's been in there with some really great wrestlers. He's taken down a lot of fighters inside the UFC over the years that he's been inside the octagon. So I do think that the well-roundedness of Trinaldo is something that could play a factor in this fight, because if they are going strike for strike and it's quite low volume and Trinaldo decides to mix things up and start shooting takedowns, then the judges are going to love that. And as I've already said, if Salikov doesn't find that knockout shot and Trinaldo is mixing things up and looking a little better, getting the edge in different areas, then Trinaldo's going to be favoured on the scorecards there. I also like this move up in weight for Trinaldo. You know, he's coming up to welterweight. There's not going to be as much of a weight cut. He is getting up there in age a little bit at 42 years old. So not as much of a weight cut. I think that'll suit him better. He's also been at American Top Team as well for the first time in his career, I believe, for this camp. So that's going to help him definitely in this spot. I think, as I've said, the fight could be very close. I think Salikov could potentially knock Trinaldo out, even though he's never been knocked out before. Salikov still holds that raw power. But I am going to side with Trinaldo being the more well-rounded fighter, and in a close fight, if he is mixing things up a little better and he's not knocked out along the way, I do think that that puts Trinaldo in a good position on the scorecards to win the fight, and it's for that reason I'm picking Francisco Trinaldo to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Alan Patrick versus Mason Jones. Mason Jones is currently the minus 290 favourite. The comeback on Patrick at plus 245 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the line's very fair. It's accurate. I did definitely expect it to be around this sort of line, even if Mason Jones was at minus 330 or minus 350. Again, that wouldn't have shocked me either. If you are looking for a value side, I would still say that Mason Jones at minus 290 is better value in a parlay than what it would be playing Alan Patrick straight at plus 245. Even though it is a big line, I just don't see it from Alan Patrick in this fight, if I'm being honest. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I mentioned that minus 330, minus 350 line. I think the closer we get to the fight night, the closer we get to Saturday night, I think Mason Jones will be in a lot of parlays. I think people will be playing his props as well. All those sort of things will increase the line, and I do think he will close closer to minus 350 than he will to minus 300. As for how this fight plays out, it's pretty simple from Patrick's perspective. If he wants any chance of winning this fight whatsoever, he's got to stick to Jones like glue. He's got to shoot takedowns from the get-go, not stay out in space. He's got to be relentless with his takedown attempts. He's got to keep Jones down for long enough throughout the rounds, or if Jones is getting back up, he's got to keep that grip, that body lock around Jones and look to either pin him against the cage or drag him back down. He's got to be ugly, dirty and grindy with this fight, because whilst these fighters are out in space, Mason Jones is going to absolutely light Alan Patrick up. Jones is going to be the better striker, better movement, faster, better combinations, more power in his strikes as well. So the gap in skill on the feet is going to be absolutely ridiculous here. That's why Patrick can't allow himself to get into these striking exchanges. He's got to take Jones down. And I think he will be able to take Jones down a couple of times, but Jones's defensive wrestling is decent. His defensive jiu-jitsu is decent as well. So I don't think that Alan Patrick will be able to take him down and hold him down. And with the way judges score fights now opposed to when Alan Patrick was dominant earlier in his career, right now, if Mason Jones lands one or two good, solid, hard combinations on Patrick during a round and Patrick takes him down a couple of times but doesn't really do a whole lot with it, then the judges will be scoring that round to Mason Jones. So this is what I mean with Patrick. I don't think he's going to be able to get the takedowns he needs, along with establishing the top control time that he needs as well. I think that Jones will be able to stand back up if he's taken down. I think he will be able to remain safe whilst he's on his back just before the stand-up as well. And whilst they're on the feet, I just don't think it's even close. I think Mason Jones is going to light Patrick up, potentially knock him out. If he doesn't, then again, I think he's going to do enough throughout the rounds to score on the judges' scorecards and take all those 3 rounds as well. So I'm picking Mason Jones to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Marina Moroz versus Manon Fiorot. Fiorot is currently the -165 favourite. The comeback on Moroz at +145 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do agree with where the betting line is. I did anticipate it being around this sort of line, but I also wouldn't have been shocked if it was -200 Fiorot either, based on her last performance and the hype that's currently behind her with her skill set as well. I totally understand it. If you are pushing me for a value side, I would say that Fiorot is the better bet at -165 than what Moroz is at +145, and I'll explain that shortly as well. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that more money's going to come in on Fiorot the closer we get to fight night. I think that Moroz isn't a bad dog bet option, if I'm being honest. But when you actually look at the hype behind Fiorot, as I've already mentioned, and the skill set that she brings to the table and how good she looked on a UFC debut, those are all catalysts that will affect a betting line throughout fight week. So I do think that Fiorot is going to close around -175, -180. If it got up to -200, I wouldn't be shocked at that either. As for how this fight plays out though, you've got to look at how and where this fight is won and lost. So with Marina Moroz, she's got that boxing background, but it's actually the takedowns and the grappling that got her the last 2 wins. She's got back-to-back wins against Sabina Mazo and Mayra Bueno Silva, and both of those wins came because Moroz was able to mix things up. She just started training with American Top Team, if I remember rightly, so that helped her mix things up. She started looking to get takedowns, to get top control time, so when things aren't going the way that she wants them to go on the feet, in the striking department, which is where her base is inside that boxing, then she has got a plan B, and that really helped her out there. And the thing is here, I think she's going to need the same thing, because Fiorot is absolutely an out-and-out striker, and I think if Marina stands with Fiorot in this fight, I think Fiorot's going to be able to piece her up. She'll out-volume her. Not only will she land more volume, but she'll land more effective strikes, the harder strikes, combinations. She'll be forcing Moroz backwards, and I really think that Moroz is at a massive disadvantage on the feet in this fight, to the point where she's going to have to score takedowns. Now with Fiorot, that's an area that she's actually developing a game in. Her wrestling defense, her jiu-jitsu, all those sort of things, and she is looking like she's progressing nicely. Every time that we do see her taken down, she can get back up to her feet, and I just don't think that, although Moroz will get takedowns in this fight, in my opinion, if she wants them, I just don't think that she's going to be able to do enough with those takedowns to take away the work that Fiorot is potentially going to do on the feet to her, similar to what I said with Mason Jones and Alan Patrick. Now, the gap in skill on the feet isn't that wide as what it was in that fight with Jones and Patrick that I spoke about, but I do think it's wide enough that if Marina Moroz is shooting takedowns and not doing a whole lot with them, and Fiorot's getting back up and landing the better shots, then she's just going to be favoured on the judges' scorecards. So if she doesn't finish Moroz, and Moroz is tough, by the way, she took a big beating from Silva and never went down. So in that scenario, if Fiorot doesn't finish Moroz and it goes to the scorecards, I just feel like she'll have done the better work on the feet, which is going to be enough to sway the judges to give her the decision win. I think that if there is a finish, it is more likely to be Firo. And I think with the striking, gapping skill and the work that she's going to put in on the feet, with Morose potentially having a wrestling and grappling game plan, I do favour Firo to win on the scorecards as well. So I'm picking my non-Firo to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got a fight that I actually like a lot. We've got Yusuf Zalal versus Sean Woodson. Woodson is currently the minus 190 favourite. They'll come back on Zalal at plus 165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, again, it's another betting line. I think that the bookies have done a really good job in regards to the accuracy on this fight card, because this is another betting line I agree with. I understand where they're getting at with Sean Woodson at minus 190, but I also see the point I see a lot of people making in that there's a lot of value on Zalal at plus 165, and although I do think that the betting line is accurate, if you are going to push me for a value side, I would say that Zalal is probably the better bet at plus 165 than Woodson is at minus 190, but like I say, I do think that the line is accurate at the same time. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that it's going to stall at some point, because it seems to be that the bigger bets are coming in on Woodson, but the bigger number of bets are coming in on Zalal. So more people are betting Zalal, but the bigger physical cash is coming in on Woodson. That seems to be the vibe that I'm getting anyway. So ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I could see Zalal being a little bit of a shorter underdog, maybe plus 155, plus 150, but I don't think the line's going to move too much, if I'm being honest. As for how this fight plays out though, so it's a really interesting fight because Woodson is a long, tall, rangy guy with a boxing background. He outputs a tremendous amount of volume now. He's hit triple figures in his last two fights, which is something really impressive, especially for a fighter that hasn't been fighting in the UFC too long. So he's a volume-based striker. Everything comes straight down the middle. He doesn't really wing big hooks, and his kicks are mixed in, but it's all about that straight punch boxing, the 1-2s down the middle, just getting in the face of his opponent and just popping the jab out, or like I say, just popping the straight right out as well. His boxing's really nice and he doesn't load up on anything, and that allows his cardio to be able to output the triple figure digits in regards to the numbers. And if this fight stays on the feet, then Yusuf Zalal, although he's a good technical striker himself, he's just going to get out volumed over 3 rounds. I don't think Zalal's got the power to fully knock Woodson out with one shot. I think he'd have to put together multiple combinations and really put everything behind his punches to try and knock him out, and I just don't see it happening. But what Zalal does have to do is he does have to close the distance, he does have to level change, and he does have to try and take Woodson down. Now, Woodson's takedown defense is improving as well. He's not easy to take down, but when he is taken down, if he doesn't get back up right away, then he can be controlled once you've established a good top position, and that's really Zalal's path to victory here. Zalal has got to take him down. He's got to just stop that initial scramble of Woodson using the scramble to get back up to his feet, establish that top position, and from then he should in theory be able to do some work on the mat. But I just don't think that Zalal's wrestling and top control is aggressive enough for it to really start making a factor in this fight. I do think that the work on the feet in the striking department is going to be the more significant action in the fight. Yes, I think Zalal will be able to break up the action, but I don't think that if Woodson is out on the feet landing 20 to 30 strikes around and then Zalal scores a takedown and has a minute on top of Woodson, I just don't think that that's going to outweigh the work that Woodson's done on the feet. But I will say this, the one thing that I don't like from Woodson, if it's true anyway, I'm only going from what I've seen on Instagram, and it doesn't look like he's gone back to train with James Krause for this camp. And if that's true, I think that's a really bad and poor decision from Woodson's side, because James Krause is doing phenomenal work right now. He's a great coach. He gives great advice in between rounds. He's got a good gym, good bodies to train with as well. So I think if that's correct, if Woodson hasn't gone back to James Krause, then that's only a detriment to his game. But still, even with that, I just feel that Woodson's going to have enough in this fight just to get past Zalal. I don't think it's going to be a whitewash, but I think on the feet, the quality that Sean Woodson has with his length and his range, Zalal's going to be constantly trying to get into range, while Woodson's going to be trying to mix between using range and also pushing Zalal back as well. I think it's going to be a difficult fight. Like I said, I do think Zalal will be able to break moments down in this fight with takedowns, but I don't think those moments are going to be strong enough to edge him out on the scorecards, and I'm not sure he finds a finish on the mat either. So for those reasons, I'm picking Sean Woodson to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this episode, we've got a grappler's delight with Claudio Puelles versus Jordan Levitt. Levitt is currently the -200 favourite to come back on Puelles at +170 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Puelles at +170. I just think the line's really wide when you look at the styles and how this fight's going to take place, where it's going to take place, and both the fighters' skill sets. I think the fight's just better matched than what the betting line suggest. And as for where the line moves throughout fight week as well, I do think it's going to close up a little bit. The current trend is actually the money coming in on Levitt at -200, so I don't agree with that trend, but at some point I do think there's just going to be too much value on Puelles for people to be betting Levitt, and I do think that's going to cause the betting line to close. Whether it actually goes under -200, I'm not too sure. Personally, I would say so, but like I say, this current trend's throwing me a little bit. I do think that Levitt will close at around -185, -190. So as for how this fight plays out, like I said, I think it's going to be a grappler's delight. Normally there's a lot of arguments when people say, okay, well, it's going to be two grapplers or two wrestlers, which means we're going to get a 15-minute kickboxing fight. I genuinely don't think that's going to happen in this fight. One of these fighters or both of these fighters are going to be looking to take the fight down to the mat. And I just think that whoever's calmer and more composed in top position is going to be the fighter that A, remains safe, and B, ends up getting the hand raised at the end of the night. And I think that Puelles is that fighter. So in regards to pure grappling skill, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think that Levitt is the better grappler and he's definitely more dangerous, but I also think that he's more erratic on the mat as well, so I think that he might rush positions sometimes. I think against another good grappler like Puelles will be able to take advantage of that. I think the scrambles are going to be insane, but the fundamentals on the mat, I think, definitely edge towards Puelles. I think Puelles is calmer, more composed. I think that when Puelles is in a top position, he's not going to rush anything. He's not going to dive from one position to another position to try and get a submission or anything like that. I think he'll just remain relaxed and, like I keep saying, calm and composed, and I think that's going to be key in this fight. I think that Levitt is definitely going to pose some danger. I think he's going to have moments where he's in top position, where he's in control. I think there's going to be moments where he's looking to submit Puelles as well, but I think Puelles' grappling is definitely good enough, especially from a defensive perspective, not just to get quickly caught in something and get taken out of there early. And I think the longer this fight goes on, I think the toughness of Puelles, I think the experience inside the cage as well, the fact that we've seen him go through brutal adversity and still come back and win fights, that's experience, and I think that's going to matter the longer the fight goes on. I think the longer the fight goes on, the more top control time we see from Puelles. I do think that Levitt might start to get a little bit tired. We have seen that in previous fights where the longer the fight goes on, you can just see it chipping away at Levitt's gas tank. I just think that Puelles, his experience, the fact that he's still developing, he's massively young himself, from fight to fight is going to help him in this spot, and I think he's got the tools to remain safe, which is key to not getting beaten by Levitt. I'm going to side with the underdog at +117, Claudio Puelles. I'm picking Claudio Puelles to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We look after long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also look after you fun gamblers that like the long shot, fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee, by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel as well. All our subscriptions are at very affordable prices as well. Just hop onto MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.